1941. A year etched in history, a turning point in the most destructive conflict humanity had ever witnessed. The fires of war, already raging across Europe and Asia, were about to engulf the entire globe. This was the year the sleeping giant, the United States, would be drawn into the maelstrom. Hope and despair hung in the balance. By 1941, Hitler's war machine, fueled by ruthless ambition and terrifying efficiency, had overrun much of Europe. Poland, France, and the Low Countries lay shattered beneath the weight of the Blitzkrieg. Britain, battered but unbroken, stood defiant, the last bastion of freedom in Western Europe. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, Imperial Japan, driven by its own imperial dreams, prepared for a gamble that would shake the world. The stage was set for a year of unimaginable brutality, staggering loss, and moments of extraordinary courage. This is the story of 1941, a year that would determine the fate of nations and reshape the world order. It is a tale of grand strategies and desperate gambles, of technological marvels and human suffering on an unprecedented scale. Most importantly, it is the story of the millions who fought, suffered, and died in a struggle for survival against the encroaching darkness. The early hours of June 22, 1941, witnessed the shattering of a fragile peace. The dawn of that day marked the beginning of one of the largest and most brutal military campaigns in history. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's long-planned invasion of the Soviet Union, unleashed the full fury of the Wehrmacht upon an unsuspecting enemy. This meticulously orchestrated assault aimed to crush the Soviet Union in a matter of months, if not weeks. 3 million German soldiers, supported by a vast array of tanks and aircraft, surged across the border in a three-pronged assault. The sheer scale of the invasion was unprecedented, with the German forces advancing along a front that stretched over 1,000 miles. The initial impact was devastating. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled and annihilated within days, and the German advance seemed unstoppable. Soviet forces, caught off guard and hampered by Stalin's purges of experienced officers, reeled under the onslaught. The purges had decimated the Red Army's leadership, leaving it vulnerable and disorganized in the face of the German Blitzkrieg. The Luftwaffe, masters of the skies, hammered Soviet airfields and communication centers, sowing chaos and confusion. Their dominance in the air allowed the German ground forces to advance with little resistance from above. Panzer divisions, spearheaded by the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks, sliced through the Soviet defenses, exploiting gaps and encircling entire armies. These armored units were the spearhead of the German advance, their speed and firepower overwhelming the Soviet defenders. The vastness of the Soviet Union, often touted as a strategic advantage, became a double-edged sword. While it provided ample space for retreat and regrouping, it also stretched the German supply lines to their breaking point. While providing ample space for retreat, it also made logistical support a nightmare for both sides. The vast distances and poor infrastructure of the Soviet Union meant that both armies struggled to maintain their supply lines. The Germans, confident in a swift victory, had underestimated the resilience of the Red Army and the harshness of the Russian winter. As the seasons changed, the initial rapid advance began to slow, and the German troops found themselves ill-prepared for the brutal conditions. As the summer wore on, the momentum of the German advance began to falter. The initial shock and awe of the Blitzkrieg gave way to a grinding war of attrition. Soviet resistance stiffened, fueled by a fierce patriotism and a burning hatred for the invaders. The Soviet people, driven by a determination to defend their homeland, began to mount a more organized and effective defense. The battles for Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev were brutal and costly affairs for both sides. These cities became the focal points of intense fighting, with both armies suffering heavy casualties. Yet the Red Army fought on, buying precious time for their comrades to regroup and for the vast industrial capacity of the Soviet Union to be brought to bear. Factories in the Ural Mountains and beyond were relocated and ramped up production, churning out tanks, aircraft, and munitions at an unprecedented rate. These factories, working around the clock, became the backbone of the Soviet war effort. The relentless production of war materials ensured that the Red Army could continue to resist and eventually push back the German invaders. Meanwhile, Soviet partisans behind enemy lines waged a guerrilla war, disrupting German supply lines and communication networks. Their efforts further hampered the German advance and contributed to the growing logistical nightmare faced by the Wehrmacht. As winter set in, the harsh conditions took their toll on both armies. The Germans, unprepared for the freezing temperatures, suffered from frostbite and equipment failures, while the Soviets, more accustomed to the cold, used the weather to their advantage. By the end of 1941, the initial blitzkrieg had ground to a halt, and the Eastern Front settled into a brutal stalemate. The war in the East would drag on for years, with both sides locked in a deadly struggle for survival. Operation Barbarossa, intended to be a swift and decisive campaign, instead became a protracted and bloody conflict. The vastness of the Eastern Front, the resilience of the Soviet people, and the harshness of the Russian winter all conspired to thwart Hitler's ambitions. The impact of Operation Barbarossa on the course of World War II cannot be overstated. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, as the failure to defeat the Soviet Union quickly led to a prolonged war of attrition that would ultimately drain the resources and morale of the Wehrmacht. Today, the battles of the Eastern Front are commemorated with memorials and monuments, a testament to the immense sacrifices made by millions of soldiers and civilians. The legacy of Operation Barbarossa serves as a stark reminder of the horrors of war and the resilience of the human spirit. While the titanic struggle raged on the Eastern Front, another theatre of war was being fought thousands of miles away in the scorching deserts of North Africa. This was a battleground that would test the endurance, strategy and resilience of both the Axis and Allied forces. Here, the British Eighth Army, under the command of the flamboyant General Bernard Montgomery, faced off against the legendary Deutsches Afrika Korps, led by the Desert Fox himself, Erwin Rommel. Montgomery, known for his meticulous planning and charismatic leadership, was determined to halt Rommel's advance. The North African campaign was a war of maneuver and logistics, fought across vast distances under a merciless sun. The harsh environment added an extra layer of complexity to the already challenging military operations. Soldiers had to contend with extreme heat, sandstorms, and a lack of water, making every movement a grueling ordeal. Both sides relied heavily on tanks and armored vehicles, and the clash of these mechanical behemoths on the open desert produced some of the most dramatic battles of the war. The vast open spaces of the desert provided the perfect arena for large-scale tank engagements, where speed and firepower were crucial. Rommel, a master of mobile warfare, consistently outmaneuvered his British opponents, inflicting a series of humiliating defeats. His ability to strike swiftly and decisively earned him a fearsome reputation and the respect of both his allies and enemies. The fall of Tobruk in June 1942 was a particularly bitter blow. This strategic port had been a symbol of resistance, and its loss was a significant setback for the Allies, shaking their morale and disrupting their supply lines. However, the British, bolstered by American supplies and reinforcements, would eventually rally under Montgomery's leadership. The influx of fresh troops and equipment from across the Atlantic provided a much-needed boost to the beleaguered British forces. The tide began to turn at the pivotal Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. This battle was meticulously planned by Montgomery, who understood that a decisive victory here could change the course of the entire campaign. Montgomery, a meticulous planner, launched a massive offensive backed by overwhelming firepower, which shattered Rommel's forces and sent them reeling in retreat. The battle was marked by intense fighting, with both sides displaying extraordinary bravery and tenacity. The victory at El Alamein marked a turning point in the North African campaign, paving the way for the eventual Allied victory in Tunisia in 1943. This triumph not only boosted Allied morale, but also demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms operations and the importance of strategic planning in modern warfare. While the land battles in Europe and Africa raged, with soldiers fighting fiercely on the ground and tanks clashing in epic confrontations, another, less visible but equally crucial conflict was being waged beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. This underwater battleground was a theatre of war that demanded immense bravery and strategic brilliance. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, a relentless struggle between German U-boats and Allied convoys transporting vital supplies from North America to Britain. The lifeline of the Allied war effort depended on these convoys, making the stakes incredibly high. The U-boats, commanded by skilled and ruthless captains like Otto Kretschmer and Wolfgang Luth, operated with deadly efficiency, employing wolfpack tactics to overwhelm their prey. These tactics involved groups of U-boats attacking en masse, creating chaos and destruction. Armed with torpedoes and deck guns, they sank thousands of tons of Allied shipping, threatening to starve Britain into submission. The sight of burning ships and the cries of sailors in distress became all too common in the Atlantic. The Allied response was multifaceted, involving a combination of technological innovation, strategic planning, and sheer determination. Convoys were strengthened with destroyer escorts, equipped with sonar and depth charges. These escorts played a crucial role in detecting and neutralizing the U-boat threat, often engaging in dangerous cat-and-mouse games with the enemy. Long-range patrol aircraft, such as the American B-24 Liberator, were deployed to hunt down U-boats on the surface. These aircraft extended the reach of the Allies, making it increasingly difficult for U-boats to operate undetected. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park in England worked tirelessly to crack the German Enigma machine, providing vital intelligence on U-boat movements. This breakthrough allowed the Allies to anticipate and counter U-boat attacks more effectively. The Battle of the Atlantic was a brutal war of attrition, fought over thousands of square miles of ocean. The vast expanse of the Atlantic made it a challenging and perilous arena for both sides. It reached its peak in the spring of 1943 as the U-boats inflicted heavy losses on Allied shipping. The situation seemed dire, with the Allies struggling to maintain their supply lines. However, the tide gradually turned as Allied anti-submarine tactics and technology improved. Innovations such as improved sonar, radar, and more effective depth charges began to tip the balance in favor of the Allies. By late 1943, the U-boat threat had been largely contained, securing the vital supply lines to Britain. The relentless efforts of the Allied forces ensured that the flow of supplies continued, ultimately contributing to the eventual victory in Europe.